I've been talking about Myanmar on and off since February last year when the military ousted the government of Aung San Suu Kyi and her National League for Democracy. And I've told people how Aung San Suu Kyi and her political party were creations of the US and British governments. They were installed into power. The goal was removing Myanmar as a key ally of China and also a key part of the Belt and Road Initiative as part of America's wider campaign of encircling and containing China, and also denying the rise of Asia altogether. And this has been going on, this conflict has been going on since February last year, so almost a year now. And you'll hear about the People's Defense Forces. These are these kids who have been recruited and given military training by armed ethnic groups. Now, who are these armed ethnic groups? I've talked about this in the past as well. This is the remnants of the British colonial army. The British, when they enter into a country to conquer it, they find the religious and ethnic divides, and then they invest immense resources into expanding those fault lines to divide everyone against each other so that they can rule over all of them. I want to show you this old article that I wrote under my pen name Tony Cartolucci from 2018 titled "Militants Threaten China's One Belt, One Road Initiative in Myanmar." And it's about these armed ethnic groups. But I referenced two very interesting articles. One is by the Irrawaddy, it's right here. Memories of World War II Run Deep, for KIO, which stands for Kachin Independence Organization. And then there is this other one from Kachinland News. So this is, both of these are opposition media outlets. They talk about the history of these armed ethnic groups. What was their origin story? So I'm going to put the links to both of these primary sources in the video description below so you could read the whole thing, but I'm going to quote from my article because it's just organized a little more straightforward. So the Irrawaddy's article, Memories of World War II Run Deep, for KIO, this is what they talk about. Prior to the outbreak of World War II, the Kachin, along with the Karen and Chin ethnic groups, comprised the overwhelming majority of local troops who served in Britain's Burmese colonial army, a force that also consisted of Gurkha from Nepal and Punjabi troops from India. The Kachin and other groups were all considered trusted martial races by the colonial authorities. In contrast, Burma's colonial army had few, if any, members of the Burman majority, a deliberate policy of divide and rule whose legacy is still felt in the country today. Absolutely. This is what's fueling all of this divide. This is what allows the United States to constantly divide Myanmar against itself and create these periods of time of intense internal conflict. But the article goes on. It says, although the KIO did not begin its armed insurrection against Burma's government until 1961, more than 16 years after the end of World War II, a good portion of the founding leadership of the KIO, including the group's first head, Seng, were veterans of the Second World War who were trained in guerrilla fighting as part of Detachment 101, operated by the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, OSS, a predecessor of the CIA, or under a similar group organized by Britain's Special Operations Executive called the Kachin Levies. So all throughout British rule over Myanmar, they used these ethnic groups to divide and rule the country. And then during World War II, they used these ethnic groups as proxies against the Japanese. And then what happened next? This is where this other article by Kachinland News comes in. It's a speech made by a British officer to his Kachin militants that he went through World War II with. And it says, "You endured many hardships, displaying extraordinary stamina and perseverance. Due to this, you have vanquished the more powerful, better equipped Japanese troops, despite having much less manpower. Defeating the Japanese is just the beginning of your legacy. Now, to protect and safeguard the recaptured lands, we will begin creating all Kachin battalions." And so this was the British pushing the Japanese out and then picking up right where they left off with this idea that they were going to continue ruling over Myanmar. In 1948, Myanmar gained its independence, but the British and then also the Americans refused to give up. They were going to continue investing in these armed ethnic groups, as well as building up in political opposition party through the National Endowment for Democracy that was in the 1980s. And this is what has led all the way up to the current crisis right now. These people are not fighting for democracy. These people are a product of British imperial divide and rule. And they are still doing exactly what they were doing when the British conquered them generations ago, really. The last video I did on Myanmar, I was talking about India's role in the US-backed destabilization of Myanmar. This was Mizoram state in northeastern India. It borders this region where these Chin fighters are operating. But the Chin fighters are actually based in Mizoram, India, and they cross over the border to fight Myanmar's military, and then they flee back over the border where Myanmar's military cannot follow them. And I talked about how these militant groups are supported by these fake human rights organizations and how these organizations are funded by the US government through the National Endowment for Democracy. Today, I want to show you how, in this case, these militant groups and these fake human rights organizations, it's actually literally the exact same people running both of them. And so it really lays bare what the US is actually doing, and not just in Myanmar, but all around the world. It is the exact same thing, but it's just so transparent in Myanmar. But before that, I want to show you something very interesting that I came across. This is a documentary by someone in Maryland. And if you're familiar with all of these US-backed organizations, if these are people that are in Maryland, it's because it's outside of Washington, D.C. And if it's in Virginia, it's because that's where the CIA is based. So this documentary is about these Chin militants and the Chin National Front. And they're speaking their own language, but there are English subtitles. And it's actually very sad when you go through this whole thing. They're telling you these really, really sad stories about how they're living in dirt. Their life is so hard when they're out there fighting. It's very depressing how impoverished and desperate these people are, but also how fanatical they are. And when you understand the colonial legacy that has created these people, these extremists, it's extremely sad. These are people who have wasted their entire life fighting a war they will never win. They're talking about not having underwear, and they're fighting an army that has warplanes and helicopters and rockets. This man right here is talking about how if you want to be taken seriously politically, you need to use violence, which is literally the definition of terrorism. He's also talking about how even among the Chin people, there is no unity. And he's saying that if you're not supporting the Chin National Front, which is the right thing to do, you're doing the wrong thing. All while he's talking about democracy, which shows you these people have no grasp on what democracy is. And what they're going to establish, if they ever somehow manage to create their own independent country, is a dictatorship where whatever they say goes, and anyone who disagrees with them is wrong. He's talking about how difficult it is just to keep the Chin people united, and he doesn't realize that his own struggle to keep the Chin people united is a microcosm of what's happening to Myanmar, and how this is exactly how imperial divide and rule works. He doesn't realize that he is a part in that, and that this independence fight that he and others are dedicating their entire lives to, how hopeless this is, how futile it is. But the reason this video really popped out was because I was researching this man, and I found him in this video. He is Salai, Bawi, Lian, Mang, and he is the head of the Chin Human Rights Organization, but he is also admittedly part of the militancy. So whether your militancy is good or bad, when you are fighting in a war, it is impossible to avoid human rights abuses. And if you are a human rights organization while also part of a militancy, there's a huge conflict of interest there, because is your Chin Human Rights Organization going to admit when your side carries out atrocities? Because atrocities will take place on both sides of a war, especially one that's been going on since the end of World War II. Now let's take a look at his organization, Chin Human Rights Organization. This is the official website. I talked about this the last video. This is the organization that's operating on the Indian and Myanmar side of the border. They say partners, and then they don't actually tell you who's funding them or supporting them directly, but they have a news page, and I showed people this before. They have a news page and all different news stories that they've collected and posted on their website. And it admits right here, in terms of funding sources, our main funders include the National Endowment for Democracy, based in Washington, D.C. They're also getting money from Canada, Europe, and also the Netherlands. And then you could just go to, say, the Chin Human Rights Organization, and you can see some of the activities that they're involved in. So this is a joint press conference, and it's addressing the United Nations. So this is a U.S. government-funded organization. It is an organization headed by a man who's also part of the militancy, and then they are trying to influence the United Nations. So you can see how it's not just a conflict of interest, but it's also a very deliberate attempt to manipulate international mechanisms to help advance U.S. foreign policy objectives. Here is the Chin Human Rights Organization in Bangkok at the Foreign Correspondents Club of Thailand. I've explained in the past how this, club, they take money from George Soros's Open Society Foundation. They lie about it. They train cadres of basically propagandists, locals here in ASEAN, Southeast Asia, and then they help amplify Western propaganda across the region. And they're using local faces to do it. And then here is Salai, Bawi, Lian, Mang. This is his official Facebook page, and he's very happy about this meeting he had with U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. So Antony Blinken is meeting with this man who's the head of a U.S. government-funded front posing as a human rights organization. He's also directly involved in the militancy in Myanmar, operating on both sides of the Indian-Myanmar border. And then also on his own Facebook page is him handling war weapons. And this was in 2021. This was just last year. This is him in Washington, D.C. And then let's get back to the Chin Human Rights Organization, his human rights organization, and they're saying their young staff members are participating in the professional fellowship program under WWII, Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative. And WWII is basically the U.S. taking young people from across Southeast Asia. They bring them to the United States, they indoctrinate them, they bring them to meet all of these politicians in Washington, the think tanks, and then they send them back to their home countries, often with a budget, to serve as a vector for Western influence and interference in their own home countries. This is what WWII does. This is standing up cadres across the region that will help in attempted regime change operations, just like what's going on in Myanmar, just like what's going on here in Thailand. So this is the type of activity the Chin Human Rights Organization is involved in. Here he is, Salai, Bawi, Lian, Mang. This is the Chin Human Rights Organization account on Facebook. And here he is in Washington, D.C. The Ministerial to Advance Religious Freedom, organized by the State Department in Washington, D.C. So he's just working directly with the U.S. State Department. Here is the tweet by Secretary of State Antony Blinken. This is him talking about that meeting that he was showing off that he attended with Antony Blinken. This was back in July 2021, and they even covered it in one of their Chinland media organizations. This is just one example of many, of an individual and of organizations that the U.S. creates to do what is essentially modern day divide and rule. These Chin militants want to carve out part of Myanmar as their own independent Chinland. There are Kachin rebels who want to do the same, and Karen, and you have militants in Rakhine State, and now you have these kids joining the People's Defense Forces in central Myanmar. They are dividing and weakening the country, and whether any of them can create their own independent state or not is irrelevant. So the point is, it's weakening Myanmar as a whole, and it is allowing countries like the United States and Myanmar's former colonial rulers, the UK, to exercise unwarranted influence over their internal political affairs. If Myanmar was united, this problem would not be happening. This conflict would not be happening. Their economy would not be in the state that it is in right now. They would be working more closely with their neighbors. They would be working with China. They would be building more infrastructure. They would be connecting all of these ethnic groups to the central economy, and they would be getting opportunities, and they would be building their lives up. Again, I want you to, honestly, I want you to go and watch at least parts of this documentary and look at their stories, listen to their stories, how futile and hopeless their cause is, and how oblivious they are to the fact that they are being used and that the people using them have absolutely no intention of giving them a better future. Now, people like Salai, Bawi, Lian, Mang, this guy, he's probably living a very comfortable life, but the people that are still out there fighting the central government and the military, they are not. And the vast majority of these people are not and never will, as long as people like this continue working with the United States and the British to continue dividing and ruling their country. All of these ethnic groups are talking about independence from Myanmar's central government. They still haven't gained independence from the British or now the Americans. If you thought this video was useful, please like and share it. Think about subscribing. It's free to do and it helps the channel grow. I have a website, newatlas.report. You can find and follow all of my work there. I'm also on Twitter for the time being, @Brian_Berletic. I'm also on Weibo, and the links to all of these will be in the video description below, so you can click on it and then you can go and follow me there. There are also links to all of the articles that I just referenced in this video, so please do check them out. There's so much information there about the history of these armed ethnic groups. It will really open your eyes to just how malicious and deliberate what the US and the British have done and are now doing to Myanmar, and how hopeless these groups are. If people do not break this cycle, this will just go on for another generation at least. Also in the video description below are ways you can help support my work. I can no longer use PayPal. PayPal makes it impossible for people based in Thailand to send and receive money. So I have replaced that option with Buy Me a Coffee. That allows you to do one-time donations. It also allows you to do monthly membership, just like Patreon. So I have Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee. To everyone who has been helping, whether it's month to month, one-time donations, or if you're sending me news tips, or if you're just sending kind comments, thank you very much. I could not do this work without that help. And as always, thank you for watching.